Welcome to the March 9th, 2025 episode of The Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and today's working title is The Achilles Heel of Canada's Oil Obsession. Now, if you're in Alberta and Saskatchewan, the reason why you'd be interested in this story is obvious. But if you're in British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, the Maritime Provinces, Manitoba, you're probably asking yourself, why do I care? Well, the reason you should care is because there's a big movement up afoot now in Canada to build at least one new pipeline and maybe multiple pipelines. I mean, Danielle Smith says that she wants to double her province's oil production, which now is 4 million barrels a day. That would be 8 million barrels a day. That's like 8 or 9 Trans Mountain expansion pipelines. So depending on who you listen to, there could be a lot of pipelines involved, and private capital doesn't want to build it. There are no private companies, TC Energy or Enbridge or any of the American companies. Nobody wants to step up and propose a pipeline. So that means one of two things. Either the government has to come forward with public money, your taxpayers' money, your tax dollars, and de-risk it. And who knows what percentage that could be. Could be 10%, could be 90%. I don't know. Or like Trans Mountain expansion, the government foots 100% of the bill and builds it through a crown corporation. So there are potentially tens of billions, maybe even hundreds of billions of dollars at risk here. And that is a big deal. And particularly because today, Sunday, March 9th, the Liberal Party of Canada is choosing a new leader. Justin Trudeau is stepping down, the prime minister, and whoever wins will be the new prime minister. And currently, Mark Carney, I think, is considered the front runner. Former finance minister Chrystia Freeland would be coming second. Be one of those two, most likely. And they could go to the governor general as early as tomorrow, Monday, and request an election. And we would have a 6-week election. And pipelines would no doubt play a prominent role in the election campaign. So this is not a small matter for us to be dealing with right here at the moment. We have said very consistently here at Energy Media, no more new oil pipelines. There's not a business case for it. Well, on Saturday, Globe and Mail columnist Adam Radwanski he wrote a piece called "Why Canada Should Heed Its Energy Minister's Call to Calm Down About Oil Pipelines." So in Canada, the energy minister is Jonathan Wilkinson. His official title is Minister of Natural Resources. That's the way we do it up here. And there's a quote from Wilkinson, because Radwanski interviewed him. And he said, and I quote, "People are getting way too ahead of themselves on the oil question." And what he means is, Donald Trump has threatened tariffs, a 10% tariff on oil and gas exports. So this is all in response to Trump. People are getting way too ahead of themselves on the oil question. Everybody's sort of running around saying, "Oh my God, we need a new pipeline. We need a new pipeline." The question is, why do we need a new pipeline? And we've been asking this question for months. Where's the business case? Show us the business case for a new pipeline. Then Radwanski paraphrases Wilkinson's opinion that the economic case for a new pipeline is, quote unquote, tenuous at best. Again, Energy Media's argument. Now, I came across this because Heather Exner-Poirot, who's the director of Energy, Natural Resources, and Environment for conservative leading Macdonald Laurier Institutes located in Ottawa, she posted it on Twitter. Here's what she had to say about it. Quote, if our energy minister still can't do the math on the benefits of oil exports for our economy and security, I just don't know what to say anymore." End quote. So I've had Heather on the podcast, Energy Talks podcast, and she's very articulate. She's one of the most articulate oil and gas proponents, pipeline proponents that I've interviewed. So I'm not to poo-poo Heather, but we don't agree on a lot. And I challenged her to show her math. So she said, "I don't do math." Which fair enough. I don't do math, right? I'm a journalist. I think her degree's in political science. So we don't do math. But who does do math is Professor Trevor Tome, an economist at the University of Calgary. And Trevor is very highly respected. And I certainly am not the person to take issue with his math. And he had written an op-ed in The Hub, it's an online magazine. The Trans Mountain Pipeline was worth every penny of its $34 billion price tag. Okay, let's dig into his numbers. Because I agree that based on the numbers he had, his argument holds. And he walks through the readers through Trans Mountain filings with the Canadian Energy Regulator that contain various financial scenarios. So those scenarios show that from now until 2044, TMX is profitable and was a good investment for taxpayers, which that's Trevor's argument in his piece. So here's the critical point. I didn't challenge Trevor's math, but I did challenge a major, and do challenge here, a major assumption behind the financial scenarios that Trans Mountain provided. Global oil demand only stays strong enough till 2044 to keep the pipeline full, and the fullness of the pipeline is called the utilization factor. Now, I checked the utilization factor. Trans Mountain estimates it'll be 96%. And I checked that against other pipeline companies, and they're generally in the 97, 98, even 99% range. So that's reasonable. Might even be a little bit on the low side. But fair enough. Even in the gloomiest scenario, which for Trans Mountain, the first decade is 79% full, and then the second decade is 96% full. All the other ones had 96% utilization. Even in the gloomiest scenario, where there are some losses in some years, Trans Mountain still turns out to be a good investment. Okay. There's the other thing that the regulator asked the company to do. It said, what are the significant risks? What are the risks that could prevent the company from achieving these scenarios? And so Trans Mountain considered a number. There was a long list on page 4 of the document if you want to have a look at it. The big one at the top of the list is the failure of oil companies. What conclusion did Trans Mountain come to? That there is a very low probability of that happening. And all of the other risks becoming an issue, very low probability. Folks, this is the Achilles heel of the entire Canadian oil industry, the Alberta government, Premier Danielle Smith, Trevor, Heather, the entire pro-pipeline movement assumes that there will always be enough demand to keep whatever pipelines we build be built so that we can access international markets instead of just the American market, that those pipelines will be full because global oil demand is going to remain strong out to roughly the middle of the century. They think the global energy system will change very little. And I take exception to that. I mean, if you spend any time on Energy Media's website, on our podcast, on this show, you'll know that we believe the energy transition is rapidly accelerating. We agree with the International Energy Agency that the peak oil demand will come in 2030. The IEA has 3 scenarios. The steps, which is basically a status quo. So you would see from 2030 to 2050 kind of a bumpy but still flat demand curve. The APS, the announced policy scenario, big drop off. So down from 103, 105 million barrels a day down to 57 million barrels a day. That would be a disaster for the global oil industry. Then, of course, the net zero scenario the demand would go down to 20 million barrels a day. But I mean, I think we're pretty much agreed now that the chances of achieving net zero by 2050 is pretty slim. So our position is that the IEA's APS scenario is the most likely. One of the reasons we do that is because we don't just read the IEA's modeling, we read S&P Globals and Rystad and Bloomberg NEF and others. And they don't all agree 100%, but they do agree on peak demand in 2030. And then the question is, what's the shape of the decline curve? Does it decline quickly? Does it decline slowly? Is it a plateau? That's up for debate. And we'll get into that tomorrow, and I'll have more to say about that in a minute. That's one risk, is that that is not considered by Trans Mountain, it's not considered by the pipeline proponents, the global energy transition. But there's another one, and this one is was found in, you can find it in the Canadian Energy Regulator's 2023 Energy Futures Report. And I interviewed the chief economist from the CER about this, and he explained it at length that if the Alberta oil sands have to pay the full compliance costs of bringing their emissions down, some of that production is uncompetitive and will go out of business. They'll shut it in. And let me explain why that is. So I've been interviewing Kevin Byrne from S&P Global for the better part of a decade about oil sands emissions. And in 2009, they were about 83 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel. Then by today, because there's been some declines, they're now at 66 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel. So there's been a substantial reduction. The problem is that that's still about 1.5 times the global average. But within the oil sands average, there are big variations. So there are some that are down, I think, as low as 37 kilograms of CO2 equivalent, which it gets very close to the North American average. So those are on an emissions intensity basis, those are much more competitive barrels. But there are some that are as high as 140 kilograms of CO2e per barrel. Those are uncompetitive. And if the producers had to spend money, carbon capture and storage, whatever it would be, to bring production from those projects down to an acceptable level, then the cost of that would be too great and it'd be uneconomic and they would be shut in. Now, there's policy, and I think that even with the election of Donald Trump and the United States withdrawal from the Paris Agreement and on, there's still a lot of momentum in the world to bring down emissions. So that's the policy side. But Kevin Byrne has been telling me for a number of years now, you can see the market struggling to price emissions intensity. So the idea is the market figures out a way to bring down the price of, like, if you have low emissions intensity, like Norway has a field that's ridiculous. It has I think it's 1/10 or 1/2 of a kilogram of CO2e per barrel. That low emissions intensity crude would sell at a premium on global markets. The 140 kilograms of CO2 oil from the oil sands would sell at a higher cost. So it would be the opposite of a premium. And he says you can see the market moving in that direction slowly because there hasn't been a lot of impetus, but it's gathering steam. And so this becomes a major risk factor, in my opinion, both policy and market changes. Not in the Trans Mountain filing at all. It is not one of the assumptions behind their modeling. So they've missed, in my opinion, two major risk factors in coming up with their scenario modeling, one being the global energy transition, the effect on demand, and the other being the potential for pricing of climate compliance that raises their costs and makes some of the production uneconomic. That's a problem. So when we say show us the business case, this is why we ask to be shown the business case, because it's not the math all that is necessarily the problem. It's the assumptions behind the math. And I've had energy economist who does a lot of modeling, Dr. Chris Bataille, on this show many times, and we've talked about. He says, and I agree with this, and other economists that I've talked to agree with this. He said all good modelers state their assumptions right up front. And that's what we're going to be talking about tomorrow, is assumptions behind one of the dominant modeling model. And that's why, and these are two assumptions that should have been in Trans Mountain's modeling, in my opinion, because then we would have had a better understanding of the potential risks to the scenarios that they created. And maybe we even should have demanded a fourth scenario where to take into account the impact that some of those risks coming to fruition would have had on the numbers. So maybe the math would have changed. Who knows? I suspect it would have. but it would be nice, for the Trans Mountain, modelers to have included that, and they didn't do it. And I think that's a major weakness here. So on Monday's episode, and it may run Tuesday because we've got, the potential for an election. If the new prime minister calls the election Monday, then obviously that's probably, what this show is going to be dealing with. And the next show will be on Tuesday. But I want to explain why the oil opponents, the oil bros, the oil defenders, where their assumptions come from. This is really important. I'll give you a big hint. OPEC, right? I know you're surprised. The cartel of dictator oil companies that the Alberta continually rants about, which of course, Danielle Smith and her energy minister, Brian Jean, are always on about dictator oil. Do you want to have ethical oil from Alberta, or do you want to have dictator oil from Saudi Arabia? And what they don't tell you is that Danielle Smith goes out for dinner with the Saudi energy minister, and when she goes to conventions, she spouts narrative that comes directly from OPEC. It's in their press releases, it's in their modeling reports. She is basically spouting Saudi propaganda. And those ideas get picked up and they get talked about there in the, like we call it the Calgary bubble or the Alberta bubble, where they don't even know where their ideas come from. They come from OPEC. And I'll show you why. I'm going to go into it in detail. You do not want to miss that episode, because once you understand what the OPEC's conclusions are, and what they conclude is that oil demand is actually going to grow from the 103 million barrels a day to 120 in 2050. That's 17 million more barrels per day of demand. That's why Danielle Smith says we want to double Alberta oil production, because in her mind, we're not entering the age of oil is not dead, as the IEA has said. It's just entering a golden age. And she wants Alberta to take full advantage of that if it can, for which you need a bunch of new pipelines. So if you don't understand the conclusions of the OPEC reports, but more importantly, the assumptions behind the report, you don't know how to answer that, because it sounds perfectly reasonable. Canada makes a lot of money off its oil exports. Why wouldn't we want to export more oil? Well, because it's incredibly risky, given where Canada is, where the global energy system is in history. This is a very, very risky time to be doubling down on basically 20th century energy and not spending enough money on 21st century energy, which is wind and solar and batteries and hydro and nuclear and clean electricity. We're electrifying the planet. This is investing in oil is a very risky proposition. That risk isn't reflected in the oil proponents' analyses or in their public narratives. So tune in tomorrow. I'm going to explain that to you, and hopefully all will make sense.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.